On August 6, 2024, the Ukraine-Russia conflict took a dramatic turn. Ukrainian forces, in a surprising and meticulously planned operation, crossed into Russian territory and seized an astonishing 1,000 square miles of land. This marked the first time since World War II that Russia had lost territory on its own soil. For a country long perceived as an invincible military giant, this incursion raises significant questions. How did Russia find itself on the defensive? And what does this mean for the future of the conflict? In this analysis, we'll dive into the facts, numbers, and strategic implications of Ukraine's bold move, and at the end, provide insights into how this could impact the future trajectory of the war. So, what really happened? The Kursk invasion on August 6, 2024, wasn't just another skirmish in the long-running conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It was a large-scale and audacious operation. Ukrainian forces, numbering over 1,000 soldiers and bolstered by modern Western military hardware, such as US-supplied M1A2 Abrams tanks, British Challenger 2s, and German Leopard 2 tanks, advanced rapidly into Russia's Kursk region. The primary target of this offensive was Suda, a strategically vital town due to its proximity to a key gas metering station that controls, according to sources, about 15% of Russia's gas exports to Europe. Ukrainian forces successfully captured Suda in its entirety, a move that not only disrupted Russian logistics but also delivered a psychological blow to Moscow. This bold capture demonstrated Ukraine's capability to challenge Russian dominance, striking deep into Russian territory and calling into question long-held assumptions about Russia's military invulnerability. So, what is the strategic and psychological impact of this operation? Is it truly a turning point in the war or simply a temporary setback for Russia? To answer that, we need to delve deeper into the broader context of the conflict. Before this operation, Ukraine was facing significant challenges, particularly in the east where Russian forces were gradually pushing them back, often by only meters a day, but with a relentless pace. Meanwhile, Ukraine's infrastructure was under severe strain. Russian attacks had decimated both military and civilian structures, including Ukraine's electricity grid, plunging much of the country into darkness at one point and severely disrupting daily life. In this context, the Khursk invasion represents a strategic pivot for Ukraine. In the Donbas region, Ukrainian forces had been increasingly vulnerable to Russian glide bombs, which were devastating against their stationary positions. By contrast, in Kursk, Ukraine's military employed a mobile approach, making them less susceptible to such attacks and allowing them to exploit the weaknesses in Russian defenses. This shift in strategy was critical. Ukraine had been losing ground and was further constrained by the limitations imposed by its Western allies, particularly the condition not to attack Russian territory directly. The question remains whether this offensive was launched with the tacit approval of NATO, but regardless, it marks a significant escalation and a new phase in the conflict. So, what does this offensive mean for Ukraine? Boosting morale. This operation has provided a massive morale boost for Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike, demonstrating that they can take the fight to Russian soil and achieve meaningful victories. Bargaining power. The captured territory and prisoners of war could serve as valuable bargaining chips in future peace negotiations with Russia. Public narrative. The invasion has shaken the Kremlin, potentially weakening Putin's position as the Russian public begins to question the military's competence and the overall direction of the war. The success of this incursion undermines Russia's narrative of dominance, bringing the war's reality closer to home for ordinary Russians, many of whom have been largely insulated from the conflict's effects. Easing pressure on the Eastern Front. By forcing Russia to redeploy troops to defend its own territory, Ukraine might relieve some of the pressure on its forces in the Donbas region, which have been under intense strain. Finally, the successful use of NATO-supplied equipment in this offensive showcases Ukraine's ability to effectively integrate Western support into its military operations, reinforcing the argument for continued aid. However, it's important to recognize that Ukraine's situation is not without its own challenges. The war has placed immense pressure on Ukraine's economy and civilian population. The ongoing conflict has led to significant displacement, economic hardship, and war fatigue among the Ukrainian people. As the war drags on, maintaining public support and the morale of its military could become increasingly difficult, especially if Western aid diminishes or if the conflict continues to escalate. On the flip side, what does this invasion mean for Russia? Many Russian conscripts, who were not expecting to engage in direct combat, have been captured, raising questions about the Russian military's preparedness and the overall morale of its forces. Then, the evacuation of over 200,000 civilians from the Kursk region has led to increased dissatisfaction and questioning of Russia's ability to protect its own territory, potentially fueling public unrest. Russia's response has been surprisingly muted, raising questions about whether Moscow is struggling to muster the necessary resources for a robust counteroffensive. The Kremlin's silence on this matter could be indicative of deeper logistical or strategic issues within the Russian military. Now let's shift focus and have perspective on the status of both militaries and losses suffered so far by both sides. Ukraine's military status since the beginning of the war. Ukraine has sustained heavy losses, including around 1,200 tanks, 1,500 armored vehicles, and 250 aircraft. Despite these significant losses, Ukraine's military remains resilient, largely due to the more than $50 billion in military aid received from Western countries. This aid has provided advanced weaponry, such as HIMARS, Patriot missile systems, and modern tanks like the Leopard 2 and Challenger 2, which have been pivotal in Ukraine's counteroffensives. However, Ukraine's human toll is equally severe, with sources reporting approximately 60,000 casualties. We have to note here that each side has conflicting data on the real number of casualties. The Ukrainian military's ability to continue its operations at the current level is heavily dependent on sustained Western support. Without this aid, Ukraine's operational capabilities could be significantly compromised, making the outcome of the conflict even more uncertain. Russia's military status. Russia, too, has faced significant losses. The Russian military has lost around 2,500 tanks, 3,500 armored personnel carriers, and over 400 aircraft. Despite maintaining a numerically superior force, the effectiveness of Russia's military has been compromised by poor morale, logistical challenges, and the impact of international sanctions. These sanctions have severely hampered Russia's ability to replenish its military hardware, reducing its capability by over 60%. Moreover, Russian troops have suffered considerable casualties, with estimates suggesting over 100,000 soldiers have been killed or wounded since the conflict began. The Khursk Invasion has only exacerbated these issues, forcing Russia to stretch its military resources even thinner as it tries to defend its own territory while continuing its offensive in Ukraine. Now let's assess the future of the conflict and what comes next. The Kursk Invasion and the broader conflict are emblematic of a war of attrition, a grueling struggle where the objective is not to achieve quick, decisive victories but to outlast the enemy through sustained pressure, depletion of resources, and psychological warfare. This type of conflict is reminiscent of other protracted wars in history, such as the Korean War or the Iran-Iraq War, where neither side achieved a clear-cut victory, but both suffered immense losses. For Ukraine, the path to victory lies in continuing to exploit the weaknesses in Russian defenses, stretching their military thin, and maintaining the morale of both its troops and civilian population. However, this strategy is fraught with risks. The longer the conflict drags on, the greater the strain on Ukraine's resources. Western support is critical, but it's not guaranteed to last indefinitely. For example, the US has already contributed over $75 billion in aid to Ukraine, but political changes in key Western nations could alter the level of support Ukraine receives. A shift in US leadership could result in a reduction or even withdrawal of aid, which would significantly weaken Ukraine's position. On the Russian side, the strategy seems to be one of steady progress, grinding Ukraine into submission. However, this strategy is also risky. Russia's economy, already under strain from sanctions and the cost of war, contracted by 3.5% in 2023, and may not be able to sustain a prolonged conflict without significant internal repercussions. History has shown that wars of attrition can lead to internal instability, as seen in Russia during World War I, when prolonged conflict contributed to the collapse of the Tsarist regime. Already, the Wagner Group's near march on Moscow earlier in 2024 signaled internal discontent, and similar internal strife could emerge as the war drags on. The most likely scenario in the near term is a continued stalemate, with both sides digging in and trying to outlast the other. However, several critical factors could alter this trajectory. Firstly, resource exhaustion. If either side runs out of critical resources, whether military equipment, manpower, or economic support, it could lead to a rapid shift in the conflict's dynamics. Russia's current ammunition consumption rates, estimated at 60,000 rounds per day, are unsustainable without significant production increases or external resupply. Ukraine, too, faces challenges, as its military operations are heavily dependent on continuous Western support, and any disruption in this aid could severely impact its ability to sustain the conflict. Second, internal unrest. Internal unrest presents a significant challenge, particularly for Russia. The economic strain, coupled with the ongoing conflict, has led to growing public dissatisfaction, which could escalate into political instability. Putin's regime could face mounting pressures as the war drags on and the Russian population begins to question the purpose and management of the conflict. In contrast, while Ukraine also faces war fatigue and economic challenges, the risk of internal upheaval appears more acute in Russia, where the political system may be less resilient to prolonged stress. Third factor is international mediation. If the conflict continues without a clear victor, international mediation could become more likely. The upcoming U.S. elections could be pivotal. If Trump returns to power, U.S. support for Ukraine could diminish, potentially forcing Kyiv to negotiate under less favorable terms. Conversely, China's influence over Russia could become a decisive factor. Should Beijing perceive the conflict as destabilizing or detrimental to its interests, it might pressure Moscow to de-escalate. Similarly, the US could use its leverage over Ukraine to push for negotiations if a military victory seems increasingly unattainable. And finally, there is the possibility of further escalation. The threat of escalation, particularly with the looming specter of nuclear weapons, remains a critical concern. Russia's nuclear arsenal is one of its most significant deterrents, and any perceived existential threat could provoke a response. While the probability of nuclear engagement remains low, it's a factor that cannot be ignored in the broader strategic calculations of both Ukraine and its Western allies. The potential for escalation to involve nuclear weapons adds a dangerous dimension to the conflict, making every strategic decision more precarious. In conclusion, the Kursk invasion is a significant chapter in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, but it's far from the final one. The future remains uncertain, with both sides facing immense challenges. The outcome of this war will likely depend on a complex interplay of military strategy, economic endurance, and geopolitical maneuvering. As history has shown, wars of attrition are often decided not just on the battlefield but also by the resilience and will of the nations involved. The coming months will be critical in determining whether this incursion is a turning point or simply another episode in a protracted and brutal conflict. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth coverage of this and other global conflicts. Stay informed, stay sharp.